Hello, and welcome to Lecture 5, Part 2, Cinematography. Here again, in our first slide, we have a still from Moonlight, directed by Barry Jenkins, Cinematography by James Laxton, your film for the week, and you should have watched the film by now, so that you can start applying the concepts as I go over them. Framing. What is framing? Very basic, the use of the edges of the film frame to select and to compose what will be visible on screen. And we should all be familiar with this, at least most of us, because we're all doing framing on a regular basis when we take pictures with our phones, right? We don't just stick the phone up and be like, oh, I hope I capture my image. No, we're careful to make sure that whatever we want is within the border, just as I have been here with my cats that are obviously in jail. Okay, so framing is important because framing doesn't just have to do with how the movie is shot, but also how it's projected. And the ratio of the frame width to the frame height is called the aspect ratio. And there are a lot of different aspect ratios. You can see aspect ratios whenever you go on Amazon to look at TVs, right? Maybe it's 16 by 9, for example. And that's giving you an idea of the relationship between width and height, which in turn gives you an idea of what the picture is going to look like on your screen, how much of that picture is going to be present. So it's important because traditionally, when home video first came about back in the 80s, and even into the 90s, as we got into DVDs, the film as it had been shot was not the same film that was projected onto your television set. So if you had, say, the projection in the middle here, 1.78 to 1, which is now what the standard television is, and you tried to project it into a TV back in the 80s and 90s, it would have been more closer to this, 1.33 to 1, which was the original Academy standard for cinema back in, say, the 1930s. And also, traditionally, a standard television, because TVs, for the first 40 or 50 years of their existence, were square, right? And so it was really the advent of home video and consumers' desire to see the entire film and not have part of it cut off, like you can see here, that led to the size of TVs being changed. And you can still get different aspect ratios in the movies as well, right? They're not all just 2.35 to 1 as you see here, although you can see why George Miller wanted to shoot Fury Road in 2.351 because so much more of the detail in the background is visible, right? And not only does it give us more of a sense of what's going on, but it gives us a greater sense of depth, right? The illusion of depth, which all cinema is ultimately trying for. So this is important to recognize that different screens are going to present your movie or television show in different ways. They might cut some of it off. They might blow some of it up. They might do pan and scan, which is what they used to do back in the 80s and 90s, where you would only see one part of the image at a time. And square is not just the domain of television either, because square is also more or less the standard that you'll get in IMAX. And because IMAX, of course, is going for height as much as it is width, if not more so. And actually, if you look at Zack Snyder's Justice League, which premiered on HBO not too long ago, with all the changes he made from the original theatrical version, you'll see that he gave it almost a square aspect ratio. And a probable reason for this was because he imagined that one day he would be showing it in IMAX. And you can see the difference here, right? If you compare the two images, on the right you have the original widescreen, the way the film was projected in theaters, 2017. And then on the left you have Snyder's cut, which is in 4:3 or 1.33 to 1, so that it fits on the square screen of an IMAX. And you can tell the difference here, right? Even though a widescreen image is pretty generous in terms of what it shows, you're getting much more of a sense of a compositional balance in the 4:3. You're getting more of a sense of horizon, right? You get more of a sense of depth. When you compare the figure in the foreground to the city in the background, you get more of the fire on the right side. And overall, it's just a fuller, more detailed image. Another example of even a boxier aspect ratio in a recent film was The Lighthouse, directed by Robert Eggers, his black and white film with Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. And the reason why they shot it in the 1.19 aspect ratio was because they wanted to give it a sense of being an older film, right? Because it takes place, I think, in the late 19th century. And so cinema in the late 19th and early century was very square in its aspect ratio and the way it was projected. And so the director's hoping that by using this high contrast black and white and this older style of aspect ratio that he can make it seem like it's a film from that era. Widescreen framing is what we're more typically accustomed to, especially if we have big TVs and we watch a lot of movies on our TV, and also typically in movie theaters if you're not at the IMAX. And again, it's just a very generous view, right, of detail, of depth. And you can see here that it doesn't have to be a big vista like we saw with Justice League. It can be a diner, two men, having coffee in a diner, and still give us all that depth and detail to really create a sense of the environment. Okay, so next concept, on-screen, off-screen space. The frame shapes our experience, drawing attention to what the filmmakers want us to see. But, as we know, the frame carves out only a little from the overall visual field. If you take your phone and you go to shoot a picture outside, you realize you can only take a picture of a small percentage of the overall outside that you're in, right? The 360 degrees behind you, all of that is going to be off screen. But filmmakers can creatively exploit the space off screen and typically do by implying what's off screen and using that to their advantage, sometimes for suspense. So in this shot from Jurassic Park, our hero is in the kitchen and suddenly she hears something and we're scared for her because we know she's in a dinosaur movie, right? And it seemed like she was safe for a second, but no, there's raptors in the kitchen. So Spielberg is manipulating off-screen space by hinting at a danger that we can't see, thus enhancing the suspense. Range of tonalities. This basically has to do with color. An image may seem all gray or stark black and white. It may display a range of colors. And again, you can see this on your phones. The ability to edit all kinds of different tones, black and white, and color, and different kinds of color stocks, different kinds of color filters, just with your phone, right? Gives you an idea of how many choices are available. And it's another one of the things that the cinematographer and the director have to decide, what is the visual look of the film in terms of the way it's going to use light and color. And they can manipulate the film stock, the exposure, right? How they expose the film, how they develop the film. But of course, many, if not most, of these qualities are now manipulated digitally, and during both production and post-production, because most film and television is shot and projected digitally now. Contrast is important. We have to decide as filmmakers how we want to use the relationship between light and shadow. A high contrast image displays bright white highlights, stark black areas, and a narrow range of grays in between. As you can see here in our still from Ed Wood. Black and white photography probably benefits more from a high contrast because there's not as many tones to allow our eyes to pick out detail, right? So the starkness of the contrast gives us more detail in a black and white image. Whereas with color, you have a much wider range of grays, right? You can see in this shot from Children of Men, and it's meant to look a little bit more realistic. Not only is he in London on a kind of a grimy, foggy day, but the whole mood of the movie, especially at the beginning, is very somber and grim. So the gray, the muted gray, really gives a sense of the world both physically and emotionally. It also allows for that little flame to really catch our attention. The range of tonalities in the image is most crucially affected by the exposure of the image during filming. Again, this is something that probably most of us have some experience with because we've seen our pictures over or underexposed depending on how much light is available. The filmmaker controls exposure by regulating how much light passes through the camera lens. This is also why they have to manipulate lighting and set it all up beforehand, because it's very difficult to control or capture natural light the way you want it. Again, as we've all seen. And exposure can be manipulated during developing and printing to create specific effects. In this shot from Fellowship of the Ring, you can see overexposed lighting in our heroes here, right? And this gives us a sense that the light that Gandalf is using is magic, right? This high intensity magic light that's so bright that it kind of just effaces them, right? And the artificiality is part of the point here because it's supposed to be magic and it's supposed to give a high contrast between the underexposed rest of the frame. And so, again, it's the filmmakers using exposure, manipulating exposure for very specific effects. Choices of exposure are particularly critical in working with color, as there are so many more hues to manipulate. As you can see in these two color shots here, where there's a lot of different colors popping out. And of course, color, again, is manipulated in post-production and editing, where they do what's called color correcting, to make sure that the final color is exactly the way they want it if they didn't capture it quite that way during the photography. Speed of motion. Speed of motion presented on screen depends on two factors: the rate at which the film is shot and the rate at which it is projected. The standard rate for film-based shooting, established when synchronized sound movies came in at the end of the 1920s, is 24 frames per second. That's how many frames per second are being projected on a screen when you watch a movie that's been shot on film. Differing the rate between shooting and projecting can result in slow motion or fast motion effects. So that's basically, or at least before digital, that's basically how they would create slow motion and fast motion. So you see the herky-jerky fast motion of like the Keystone Cops, right, in early cinema. And then finally, digital cinematography. We've talked about it throughout the lesson. You can't not talk about it now when you're talking about cinematography. It's basically the process of recording the motion picture using digital image sensors rather than film stock. As digital technology has improved in recent years, this practice has become dominant. Since the mid-2010s, most movies across the world are captured as well as distributed digitally. And the reason for that is basically because it's easier and it's cheaper. It's much cheaper to, film is expensive, so it's much cheaper to be able to shoot with digital, erase what you don't need, keep shooting until you got the image that you want. But it's also a lot less expensive to be able to project it, because all you have to do is send the hard drive to the movie theater, or at some point it'll probably just be streaming from a central location once the bandwidth is high enough. Obviously, that's much cheaper than loading up canisters of film onto a truck, putting it on a plane, sending it to the theater, and somebody's got to sit there and tape them together and then project them through the projector. And as of 2017, professional 4K digital film cameras were approximately equal to 35 millimeter film, which is the kind of film that mostly is used to shoot feature films historically, in their resolution and dynamic range. However, digital film still has a slightly different look to analog film, and some filmmakers still prefer to shoot on film. And Martin Scorsese is one, and Quentin Tarantino is one. Steven Spielberg, a lot of these traditionalists, guys that grew up worshiping the movies, and they want their movies to have a relationship with those older movies. So part of it is nostalgia and wanting to kind of work the way their forebears worked, but part of it is visual as well. And Christopher Nolan being another one, shooting Dunkirk on film, right? Because the picture is slightly different. It looks a little bit grainier. Some would argue that the colors have more dynamic range, and that with digital photography, they're just a little bit brighter, right? They're just a little bit harsher, and so some people want to have that more muted, that more subtle effect, that grainier effect that only film can provide. But of course, because film is more expensive, it's only these powerful filmmakers who can kind of call their own shots, who are really able to use it. Okay, so that's the end of that lesson. And the next lesson, we will talk about even more elements of cinematography. And yes, there are a great deal of them.